Hello again everyone, welcome back to the channel, and to part 5 in my Conquest of Britain series. Now in the last part in this series, we followed Suetonius Paulinus in his conquest of the island of Anglesey. But whilst he was away in northern Wales, the flames of rebellion started in southeastern Britain, in a revolt so destructive it nearly drove the Romans out of Britain entirely. This is the story of the Boudiccan Revolt. The Boudiccan Revolt probably only lasted a few months, but its story has reverberated for nearly 2,000 years. It left towns in ashes, tens of thousands dead, and was the closest that the Romans got to losing Britain in the 1st century AD, and potentially caused Emperor Nero to think, Britain's just not worth it, is it? But how much of the story is history and how much of it is legend? Well, the ancient writers, primarily Tacitus and Cassius Dio, may have exaggerated Boudicca's role somewhat. They give her fiery speeches, making her the embodiment of native resistance. And some modern scholars have decided that she may have been little more than a figurehead, with her role being inflated in order to discredit Emperor Nero. Regardless, though, whether she was a legitimate warrior queen or merely a figurehead, she is so deeply embedded in Britain's identity that you can't simply remove her from the rebellion that bears her name. Now, her name even causes controversy. Is it Boudicca with one C? Is it Boudicca with two Cs? Or is it Boudicca? The latter of which being made famous in the 18th and 19th centuries, probably through a copyist's error. Now, her name might not even be her name. It might even be a title, potentially meaning victory. But for now, we will plough on ahead, using the ancient sources of Tacitus and Dio to give us the framework of the revolt. But in the future, I might do a video exploring the real Boudicca and what evidence we have for who she really was beyond the myth. But for now, let's dive in. Now, Boudicca, of course, was queen of the Iceni, a tribe that lived in more or less modern-day Norfolk. Now, during the Claudian invasion, they avoided conquest by allying with Rome, potentially being one of the 11 tribes that surrendered to Claudius in Camulodunum. The Iceni were ruled by their king, Prasutagus, who was also the husband of Boudicca. And he ruled as a client king, keeping his status whilst also acknowledging Roman authority. And other than a brief flare-up in 47 AD, when the then governor of Britain, Publius Ostorius Scapula, caused an Iceni revolt when he tried to disarm them, the peace held, and the Iceni were able to live a form of independence in Rome's shadow. However, when Prasutagus died around 59 or 60 AD, trouble erupted. Now, in his will, he had been smart enough to realise where the wind was blowing, so he left his kingdom equally between his daughters and Emperor Nero, a form of compromise in order to support his family and his people. But Rome didn't see it that way. The procurator of the province, Decianus, descended on Iceni territory, along with soldiers, to seize what he saw as the emperor's inheritance. He also demanded the repayment of debts. Seneca, the philosopher and political advisor, potentially asked for huge sums of money back, as did many other wealthy Romans. And earlier gifts to the Iceni from the Romans were now being reinterpreted as debts. The Iceni nobles were stripped of their wealth and their lands, and Boudicca herself was flogged. But worse still, her daughters were publicly raped. This wasn't just some personal insult. This was a message to every tribe. Rome did not care about its allies, treaties, or native dignity. Now, it's important to remember that the Britons had already endured nearly 2 decades of Roman exploitation. The neighbouring Trinovantes, who had been freed from the Cativalorni, now found themselves under harsher Roman rule, with a lot of their lands being taken from them to give to veterans who had been settled in Camulodunum. Heavy taxation, corruption, and arrogance were all adding fuel to the fire. Normally, Rome thrived by keeping tribes divided, encouraging old rivalries. But now, as with Cassivellaunus and Caesar, old rivalries had been put aside. Boudica rallied troops quickly. The Trinovantes certainly will have joined her, as potentially did other tribes in the southeast, potentially as far as South Wales. And the rallying cry was the outrage of what happened to Boudica's 2 daughters. But it's important to remember that it was all built on a base of 17 years of disappointment and abuse. The time had come to strike, and the first target was Camulodunum, the colony of retired veterans. It was everything that the Britons despised: stolen land, bullying settlers, and that huge Temple of Claudius towering over the formerly Britannic settlement. Boudicca attacked with overwhelming force, and the settlers in Camulodunum didn't have any proper defences. They desperately sent a message to Catus Decianus asking for aid, but Catus only sent 200 badly equipped men, scarcely even a gesture. Quintus Petilius Cerealis, on the other hand, who was in charge of the 9th Legion Hispania, possibly in Lincoln, did send a detachment of the legion to help. But they were cut to pieces, and only the cavalry, along with Cerealis, were able to escape. Camulodunum was stormed by Boudicca's forces, and the Romans retreated into the Temple of Claudius, where they held out for another 2 days before being completely overwhelmed. The colony was slaughtered, and you could still see the level of destruction there today, as underneath modern Colchester is a thick layer of ash and debris that comes from this attack, which is called the Boudiccan Destruction Horizon. When news of Camulodunum's fate reached Decianus, he panicked, abandoned his post, and fled over to Gaul, leaving Britain to its fate. Luckily for the Romans, Suetonius Paulinus, fresh off his defeat of the Druids of Anglesey, was not so easily panicked, and he ordered the legions to march southeast, whilst he went ahead with some cavalry to assess the situation. He reached Londinium, which was already a bustling trading hub, but was also Boudicca's next target. Now, looking at Londinium, he realised it didn't have any necessary walls, any necessary defensive structures, so he didn't want to risk his legions in a battle with Boudicca in Londinium. So he made the decision to abandon it. Now, he told the residents of Londinium that anyone who was fast enough could accompany the legions, but everyone else was left to their fate. Boudicca's warriors descended upon the undefended Londinium. They massacred the inhabitants and burned it to the ground. And modern archaeology has found yet another destruction layer, more evidence of the destruction. Boudicca now turned her attention to Verulamium, modern-day St Albans, which had some earthworks but very few defenders. Interestingly, Tacitus tells us that Boudicca and her army preferred not to be involved in long, hard sieges. Instead, they targeted undefended towns that were rich in loot. And as a result, Verulamium faced the same fate as Camulodunum and Londinium: slaughter, pillage, and fire. Tacitus estimates 70,000 dead across the 3 settlements, with deaths by hanging, burning, and crucifixion. but his language is pretty restrained compared to that of Cassius Dio, who talks about women being mutilated, impaled, and being tortured in the most grotesque ways. Whether exaggeration or not, the horror was real. By this point, Paulinus had mustered 10,000 men, with men from the 14th Legion and the 20th, along with auxiliary troops and additional cavalry. Crucially, however, he didn't have any men from the 2nd Legion Augusta, who were based in Exeter at the time because its commander, Suetonius Paulinus, refused to come and help, despite Paulinus ordering him to do so. Was it because he was fearful of Boudicca, fearful of local unrest? We don't know, but the decision of Paulinus would come back to haunt him. It was finally time for the Battle of Watling Street. Now, Paulinus chose his battleground very, very carefully. He found a narrow defile with woods behind and a plain in front, which would prevent an ambush and also cause Boudicca's men into a bottleneck. And the Romans deployed in their normal fashion, legions in the centre, auxiliary on the flanks, and cavalry on the wings. Boudicca's forces, according to Cassius Dio, numbered some 230,000 men, which is probably an exaggeration. Tacitus doesn't give us a number, but does stress their superiority in numbers. Now, the Britons had brought with them their families, who were arranged in wagons behind them, which was a crucial mistake, because it blocked off any chance of retreat. Before the battle, Tacitus put stirring words in Boudicca's mouth, reminders of Roman outrages, and also a call for freedom.
We British are used to women commanders in war. I am descended from mighty men, but now I am not fighting for my kingdom and wealth. I am fighting as an ordinary person for my lost freedom, my bruised body, and my outraged daughters. Nowadays, Roman rapacity does not even spare our bodies. Old people are killed, virgins raped, but the gods will grant us the vengeance we deserve.
The speech he gave Paulinus, by contrast, urged discipline. Just keep in close order, throw your javelins and then carry on. Use shield bosses to fell them, swords to kill them. Do not think of plunder. When you have won, you will have everything. Cassius Dio expands on these speeches, even having Boudicca releasing a hair from her cloak as an omen. The battle was short and decisive. The Romans threw their pila into the densely packed Britons, and then they advanced in a wedge formation, with the auxiliaries and the cavalry making their way down the flanks. And the battle turned into a complete slaughter. The Britons ended up getting stuck against their own wagons, the ones that they brought their families on. And the Romans were able, according to Tacitus, to kill 80,000 Britons to only 400 Roman dead. Boudicca didn't last much longer after the battle. According to Tacitus, she took poison to avoid capture, whilst Cassius Dio claims that she died of illness, and her daughters disappear from the historical record. Suetonius Paulinus, the commander of the 2nd Legion Augusta, having heard of the victory at Watling Street, was so ashamed at not bringing the 2nd Legion Augusta to the fight that he later committed suicide. The exact location of the Battle of Watling Street isn't known, as the ancient sources only give us vague details. Historians and archaeologists have hotly debated the subject over the following centuries and have proposed a number of different places that it could have been, with one of the most prominent being Manchester in Warwickshire. The revolt was crushed, but the consequences were enormous. Much of Britain was devastated. 3 whole towns were burned to the ground, tens of thousands of people were dead, and Roman prestige was shattered. Reinforcements poured into Britain, and the 9th Legion Hispania was rebuilt to its full strength, having taken severe casualties as a result of the attack by Boudicca. Decianus, whose greed and arrogance had started the revolt, remained in Gaul in disgrace, and was replaced as procurator by a man called Julius Classicianus, a Gallic procurator who urged leniency. Paulinus, on the other hand, was not interested in leniency. He unleashed brutal reprisals, laying waste to all sorts of tribal land. And Classicianus warned him that such reprisals would just prolong unrest. But Paulinus would not listen, and as a result, Emperor Nero sent his freedman secretary, Polyclitus, to sort it out. Now, the arrival of Polyclitus astonished the Britons, who saw his immense entourage and found it very strange how someone who had been a slave had managed to get to such a level of authority. Now, Polyclitus's decision was to recall Paulinus, supposedly due to loss of ships. So the rebellion was over, but the scars ran deep. For Rome, they very nearly lost Britain entirely. As for Boudicca, she became a legend, a symbol against oppression, her story living through centuries of history, poetry and myth. But thank you very much for watching. Please remember to like, comment and subscribe, it helps immensely, and I'll see you on the next one. Ciao ciao for now.